There's a reason a lot of this manufacturing was moved out of the US. It was deemed unsafe. So like our plastic pollution problem, where we just keep dumping it on other countries, we're like, all right, you guys deal with these cancerous materials, not us. And that's not okay.
Hey, Carl, how's it going?
All is good, Iram. How about with you?
Things are going well. There's been a lot of things going on in the news lately. What have you been reading?
Oh, man. Some really great news. The Financial Times just reported that drug developers raised $6 billion in January, which is the largest total since February 2021. So we know biopharma has had a tough couple of years in funding. It's been time for a recovery on the funding side of that part of the biotech industry. So the question is that going to remain over time? We kind of see it with some of our clients. There is an optimism on the biopharma side, and yet there's still a lot of concern because a lot of companies were running out of cash. So I think we're not out of the danger zone, but it's a good sign when more people are investing in biopharma. And hopefully some of that investment trickles into non-healthcare biotech, even though I think the two are very separate from each other, and they should be.
Yeah, they're also very close together because biology is an ecosystem, I would say, in terms of how people are making pharmaceutical drugs and the whole life cycle of that is something we should talk about. When people take pharmaceutical drugs and go to the bathroom, that there's still a half-life that goes into the world. Curious if you know what type of biopharma companies. Has AI been playing a role in this? I don't know if you saw any specific type of companies that were getting the money this year.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't dug into the numbers yet, but we have seen a lot of money go into AI-related biopharma companies. It seemed like that was really the hot space. I think next time I'll report on bigger implications of this report. And then I think we should contrast it with the report that SymBioBeta put out on funding for synthetic biology, because that was something that was released in February and we haven't even talked about it yet.
Oh, yeah, definitely something to dig into.
Yeah. So our last episode was with Albert Annis, who talked about Valley DAO and this idea of the decentralized autonomous organization, which is something that is relatively new. DAOs were in the news also this week because Wyoming has become a DAO-friendly state. They're the pioneers in creating laws for these new corporate structures. And it turns out that the LLC was first codified by law in Wyoming as well. So I think that's very exciting. You'd written something in the notes about challenging common structures. What was that about?
Well, I think the DAO is a system that has been created to challenge the common capitalistic structure of business. And it's really interesting to see, and I would love to learn more about how Wyoming is approaching this. When it comes to law, you're still participating in a system and a structure, which we need. You don't have to be vigilante about this, but I do appreciate that there are new ways of doing things because the world is changing. We have new technology, we have different societal structures when people from different cultures are coming together, from different equity backgrounds, the way that we're being educated, the way that we're consuming content. A lot of things are changing. So why not our structures? We just have corporations, which there are different flavor of corporations, and even nonprofit is a corporation. But what about DAOs? I think that's really important. I'm excited to see what new companies will start leveraging DAOs and how much of a commonplace it will be, what will be the challenges of DAOs, but what will be the opportunities. And I think a big thing that would be interesting is if an existing company can convert into a DAO. That I think would be interesting. I had that thought about, okay, just stay with me, about Pfizer becoming a DAO. And really because weeks ago I had posted something about 23andMe. They're facing challenges, and a lot has to do with them approaching biology and genomics data very similarly to tech companies in a corporate structure, just getting data and selling it. So let's change the game. I mean, our genetic information is very valuable. It's very close to us, and it could be helpful for pharmaceutical drug development, for personalized medicine, for diagnosing and creating treatments for specific types of populations. So I think it'd be a very interesting structure to consider. And so I started thinking about this more recently because I've been reading this book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and it was actually awarded to me because I won a raffle. There's a gentleman by the name of Nathan Palmier, who we know. We met him through his efforts at BioBrew, which is AB InBev's contract biomanufacturing arm. And this book is amazing, Carl. It is written by this woman who is Native American, but she also studied botany through the formal scientific discipline. I'm still reading it, but there's a chapter about how in the Native American culture, there's an origin story of a woman coming from the sky, coming to Earth, and the Earth being gifted, and that she is appreciating Earth and has seeds that she shares with the animals of Earth, who she treats with respect and sees as persons. She's like, okay, the beaver people, the turtle people. And it's this story of this Earth is a beautiful place. It belongs to everyone. It belongs to no one. And that's how Native American culture started with this notion. Then she contrasts it with the story of Eve and being banished for eating a fruit, which in the Native American cultures, like fruits and vegetables and plants are cherished. But then she's banished to Earth, which then already puts Earth in a bad light. Why are you banishing someone to Earth? And Earth being considered the stopover to a better place. Eventually you'll go to heaven. But there's a lot of culture, especially in the Western European, those cultures that believe in the monotheistic religions, that their lives stem from those stories. So how does that influence the way we act with Earth? Are we just extracting and trashing it because we're on our way to heaven? And I'll certainly share some more insights. I'm sure it's going to influence the way I talk about biology, but I just thought it was so fascinating, the contrast between the Sky Woman and Eve.
It's also super interesting. I'm reading Read, Write, Own, which is a book about the use of blockchain to reshape the future of the internet. And it's written by Chris Dixon, who's an entrepreneur who also is an investor at A16Z. And I'm only about halfway through the book, but he's starting to get into what is blockchain, what does blockchain enable? And this is one of those things that Albert talked about in that he mentioned Constitution DAO, a group of people coming together to raise money to buy a physical copy of the US Constitution. They ended up raising something like $40 million, but were outbid by hedge fund manager Ken Griffin. But your idea of someone buying Pfizer, I think is more likely to create a DAO that would buy 23andMe. The market cap is much lower. Were someone to come up with a compelling argument as to why 23andMe should be a DAO, I think that could be an interesting exercise and thing to do. First, you'd start out by buying a board seat, which means buying a controlling share of the stock. And then you go from there to take it over. And then how do you turn their assets into something that's for the public good as opposed to something that they are just making money from as a private company? But I think it's super interesting to be looking at these different points of view. I love this braiding sweetgrass idea. I want to read that and contrast it to Read, Write, Own.
Yeah, let's do a book club.
Yeah, exactly.
Carl, you just said something so crazy. I don't want to pass over it. Maybe we should just do it. Let's create a DAO to raise money to buy controlling shares of 23andMe and sharing it with the people who put
the money into it.
Yeah, put the money into it, who got their DNA analyzed.
What's going to be the first DAO that replaces the so-called activist investors, these guys that do exactly what I said, where they buy a controlling share of a company, buying controlling shares of companies like Disney, forcing them to divest certain assets, restructure the company. Along the way, they're making money because they own a controlling share and the stock price soars. So who's going to be the first DAO that takes that direction to reform or change certain corporations out there in a better way? Super interesting. So how do we use all that to transition to today's episode?
Well, someone who's, I would say, an activist, entrepreneur focusing on climate and the rights of people at chemical companies is our friend Jackie Amable. I'm so excited that you met her and encouraged her to come on the podcast. Everyone's in for a treat. Where did you meet her again?
So Jacqueline was another person that I met at this year's Biofabricate in Paris. At the last Biofabricate in 2022 in New York, there was a lot of talk of replacing polyurethane coatings. You had a bunch of companies who are working on, I hate to say alternative to leathers, but new biomaterials that have performance characteristics that mimic leather, but actually have performance characteristics that are very different from leather. Unfortunately, at the time, 2 years ago, these companies were all still using polyurethane to coat their product. And polyurethane is what's used to coat all leather products. It coats your shoes. It's probably in the top 5 most used plastics. I think Julia of Sway mentions how pervasive polyurethane is. So when Jacqueline got on stage and talked about their biological alternatives to polyurethane, I was like, we really want to get her on because she's someone who's solving a massive problem. And she's also solving a problem that a lot of these innovators in the room were having. So I think having someone come on who is solving a problem for a lot of people, not just the innovators in the room, is super important. And I think that with that, we should just let Jackie introduce herself. Jacqueline Amable, welcome to the Grow Everything podcast. We are so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Carl and Aram. It's so exciting to be here today.
We were very much admiring your very green background. I know this is a podcast, but we do post video clips on YouTube. So your background will make many people jealous because it is a true background, unlike our fakely generated AI backgrounds.
Well, thank you.
So we're going to talk about your company, Matereal, today. And I was hoping you could give us an overview on the inspiration behind the company. Also give us some background on you. You've been at the helm of a number of companies, but let's start out by talking about Matereal.
So Matereal is my first time joining as a co-founder and as CEO. At Matereal, we are leveraging breakthrough chemistry and AI to bring new bio-based or renewable plastics to market in order to decarbonize and detoxify supply chains with a focus on textiles. I met my now co-founder and CTO when I was the managing director at Venture for Climate Tech. Immediately, I was obsessed with Phil. He's just the nicest scientist I've ever met and had the chance to work with. He's also just an absolute genius in his field. Many people, especially if you know algae, you know Phil. But it was when he decided to hire a CEO that I realized the opportunity to join the team. Weirdly enough, both Phil and I have strange connections to plastics. So his first job was at a plastics factory where his dad and uncle worked, and he hated it. He was like, I never want to work in another plastics factory again. This is just, the fumes, et cetera. And my first company was a wearable tech, and I was sourcing plastics. And I remember it was 2016, and I went to Thailand, and we're talking to our manufacturers, and I was like, how sustainably can I make my product? And they're like, oh, yeah, not at all. There's no option. It's like, good luck. And I was like, all right, well, at least I need to know it's not a sweatshop. I need to know that we're sourcing from good people and that I can feel good about who I'm sourcing from. And so they dutifully took me to a middle of nowhere jungle to see this plastics factory. And I left a really visceral impression, realizing that even a well-run factory, people were being exposed to things that you could just tell were harmful. It may not have been intentional, but it's still very much a problem with plastics.
Yeah, I mean, it's so crazy. It's totally ubiquitous. I know I've become way more aware of it. I mean, they talk about plastics in our food, but then all of our personal care products have plastic in them. They're in these plastic containers. Our clothing is coated with plastic. It's really a incredibly challenging problem. It's another hyper object, something so vast that it's hard to comprehend it.
It's some insane data point. The IEA has the report of petrochemicals, and today they're 15% of oil and gas. And by 2030, it's projected to be 30%. So it's like we're decarbonizing buildings and cars and yet ignoring what everything is made out of today. That's pretty scary, right? Because this is some really toxic stuff. It's so ubiquitous. You look at it and you think that's a shoe, not that's a toxic piece of plastic.
Yeah, and the health effects are just astounding. Estrogen lowering, sperm counts down, all that kind of stuff. And people don't even think about it because the convenience of it has become so ingrained into our lives that we don't think that it's plastic that's causing any of these issues.
Yeah. I read the book To Die For. I can't even go on a plane the same and look at it the same. If you haven't read the book To Die For, it talks about how the stewardesses on airplanes were unfortunately the guinea pigs of these performance materials, and many died from the illnesses. And people kept saying, it can't be the clothes. And it was the clothes. It's been very eye-opening. But I think that's why with plastics, we always say our mission is dual: decarbonize and detoxify. Because if you're going to go through this monumental effort, which it is, right? It's a monumental effort to redefine these global supply chains, then we should fix both problems at the same time and not just one. It takes decades to make these switches. And so let's do it right this next time.
I love the way you think. That's just incredible. I mean, we have been talking to other companies that make materials and they're doing it sustainably. I just loved how you positioned it to detoxify and decarbonize. It's brilliant. But I think this also comes from your experience. So you mentioned you worked in venture, that you had another company. Can you just share a little bit more about your background, just so we have an idea of how you got here, and then we'll dig into Material a bit more?
In some way, shape, or form, I've always worked in community safety. It's kind of like how I think about it. My first company was called Revolar or Revolar. Since Carl, I know you speak Spanish. It's an ode to survivors of violence, a means to fly again. Unfortunately, it was inspired by my little sister who was attacked twice before the age of 17. My co-founder this is the craziest story. Her grandmother was kidnapped by guerrillas and held in the jungles of Latin America. It's wild to think the lack of safety. And while I was building that company and got to work with incredible investors and was sourcing those plastics, I ran across research from Bill Nye, the science guy, and I haven't been able to re-find this video and it kills me. I'm like, where did it go? But he talks about how if you really want to keep communities safe, you have to solve for market inefficiencies, aka the climate crisis. He's like, you're not going to be able to keep people safe. And so I had done a lot of research in university around refugee camps. And when we think about keeping the people we care about safe, keeping the planet safe, to keep people safe, the planet has to be safe. These things are so intertwined. They're so interdisciplinary and intersectional. So for me, it was this evolution. It was during that first building of the company that I became close with the folks at NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And they were like, hey, Jackie, when you're done, we need your help. And I was like, what on earth could I help you geniuses with? I am not a scientist. I do not have a PhD. And then I very quickly, from working with them, was like, oh, I got it. You need me to translate. Like, you need me to translate your genius into something commercial. And I was like, okay, I can do that. I've been translating my whole life in some way, shape, or form. I joke that I'm like a professional summarizer. I translate science now to venture, to customers, or to consumers and helping them understand. So fast forward, sold that business in 2017. So many great experiences, but a hard exit because that was before the Me Too movement. So half the people I spoke to were like, this isn't a problem. I'm like, yeah. It's kind of like when you find climate denialists, you're like, are you serious? You're still denying this today? And that's what it felt like with Revolar. And then worked for some of my former investors, Techstars covering the Americas. It was during my tenure there that my team launched the Techstars Global Startup Weekend Sustainability. When you launch a new vertical, you don't know how are people going to respond? How many countries are going to sign up? 64 countries signed up in our first year. And we were like, okay, whoa, like that was so much higher participation than we anticipated. I mean, it was truly a global experience to see that movement. So I knew that the time was coming, just like how that Me Too movement was the time for that understanding. It felt like the science was there, but it was starting to click with everyday people in a way that surprised me, but also delighted me. And I knew I wanted to go full time into sustainability. I spoke with my former investors and I was like, I have some company ideas. And they're like, Jackie, we know that you're a great operator, but my first job out of college was actually a teacher. I did Teach for America. And they're like, have you thought about running a climate program with your manufacturing experience? You would be really beneficial and you could 10x your impact every year. So I was like, okay, so I put some of my climate company ideas on pause and very quickly found the role of managing director for venture for climate tech. So it was sort of a founder role. I was the founder of that program. I got to build it from the ground up, design the program, the team. We had incredible outcomes. And of course, now I met my co-founder. And I guess I was hoping that that would scratch the itch. But what I learned from being on the investor side of the table is that their jobs are really hard. And in a way that I didn't think that I was, at least with my current skill set, investors are helping their founders fundraising themselves. They live in term sheets all day long. But I thrive as an operator, getting to work with the intersection of engineers and tech and being in the trenches with a team. I literally met my co-founder when I was 5 months pregnant. And the first thing I said when I came back was, I still found a CEO, because if not, and that's when I realized, like, all right, you want to do this, you want to go back to the other side of the table. And so I did have some people surprised that I went back to being a founder. They were like, I thought you were going to announce a fund. And I was like, I know that probably would have made sense, but I just felt like this is where I could make the impact. I understood the supply chains. I understood the brands, the customers, and I wanted to go back to being an operator. I was really excited that Phil embraced me with open arms and let me join.
That's so awesome. Such a good story. So tell us now about the company. What was it about Phil and what he was building that attracted you, and what does Material do?
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, when he first told me non-isocyanate polyurethane, I think my eyes glazed over. I was like, what? But what I saw was the way that every chemist PhD freaked out over this tech. They were like, wait, what? how does this work? There's the sheer enthusiasm, but also my co-founder is brilliant in many ways. Marketing and sales is definitely my wheelhouse. His former website, I think about the amount of customer pipeline he had, the level of executives reaching out to him for a product that didn't exist. He spun this out of the lab in 2020. The pandemic hit. He had nothing but his basement lab for 2.5 years.
Wow.
And the presidents of some of the biggest chemical companies were reaching out to him, asking what he was up to. Huge brands, we want to pilot this. What I realized was that all he needed was somebody to come in and build the foundation of a business around this technology, but that I wasn't going to have to pitch it. We have spent basically $0 on marketing. I think Biofabricate was even our first time publicly presenting. Yet the outreach from the community has been overwhelmingly positive and like the desire to partner. And so for us, it was wanting to make that difference and wanting to shed light on what I think is like a really invisible plastic, because polyurethane is your shirt, it's your shoes, it's the bag, and you don't associate it with plastic because it doesn't look like a single-use plastic. It doesn't feel like a plastic. And so it's like a secret, like a secret plastic. So it's been kind of fun, the challenge of trying to market what is basically an invisible product.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the product and how you look at it from a biological lens. And I understand that you guys are leveraging unique machine learning and AI and bio-based plastics to drive this innovation to decarbonize the chemicals industry. But can you elaborate a little bit more on this process? What's the AI doing? What kind of data are you looking at? And how has it worked to achieve your sustainability goals?
So at our core, our platform can use many bio-based feedstocks. The one we speak about publicly the most is linseed oil. Why? Because it's in our white paper, so we don't have to give away all our trade secrets. But the genius of Phil's, he realized that while he's an absolute expert in algae, that algae, for our purposes, it can work for lots of other companies. But for the kind of commodity material we were going after, we needed feedstocks that were scaled, affordable, et cetera. So things like linseed oil are a great example. They mimic algae in its chemical composition. We take a renewable lipid, we turn it into a glue, and then instead of methanol, we capture atmospheric CO2. So we actually use CO2 as a core, and it's about 18% of the weight of our polymer in every formulation. And then we take a bio-based cross-linker as a final step. So that's the core science. Now, where the AI comes in and how I think about AI is that AI is not a what, it's a how we do business. What would Dow Chemicals have looked like if they had access to the tools that I now have access to 100 years ago when they started their business? How much faster could they scale? Could we grow into an innovation hub model where instead of constantly building facilities, we're working with incumbents to retrofit because we use conventional equipment? That's something very unique to our tech. There's actually no bio process. It's a purely chemical process leveraging bio inputs. We're able to leverage these scaled supply chains and with AI, get to the right formulations faster, partner with industry faster, as well as essentially translate these impact metrics for them. For example, we know that our formulations are on average 50% less carbon intensive than conventional polyurethane. That accounts for things like the growing and the transport, because I get asked that. Yes, it does account for that. But we also have early data. So we've been pioneering something called the UseTox tool. It's an LCA for toxicity. Up until recently, I could tell you we're safer. I could tell you stories about isocyanate, the Bhopal tragedy in India that killed tens of thousands of people and 500,000 were impacted for life. This is a really dangerous chemical born from phosgene. But now I can say with data backing it up that it's almost 1,000,000 times safer. And I didn't think I'd get to say such an insane stat like that, but it's true. For us, it's really exciting because that, again, is where that platform comes in, because each formulation is unique like a snowflake. And we have to be able to tailor that for the application and end use. Our goal is to create a platform that allows us to expedite that progress because we don't have 50 years to change out these supply chains. We have probably less than a decade. And so we need to get moving. We believe that AI will be the how we build a business and the how we deliver.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
Can we talk a little bit about this idea of being able to use existing facilities? I always say that when it comes to the oil and gas and plastic industry, what we're talking about is trillions of dollars of infrastructure
Oh, yeah.
that were built over a century. We're not going to be able to replace that quickly. The capital costs were just so intensive and no one wants to lose their investment. So hearing you say that you guys could basically use existing facilities makes me really happy because we do need to decarbonize those particular facilities. Talk about what that might look like. You guys are in Colorado. Let's say I've got a facility that's producing plastic in New York or in El Salvador. How would that work?
Probably the most clear example I can give on how that would work is our reactors. So we use stir tank reactors, which are used by just about everybody. I remember asking my team, what kind of reactors do we use? They're like, conventional. I'm like, well, what does that mean? They're like, they're stir reactors. I'm like, what does that mean? They're like, Jackie, everybody uses these. Everybody does some kind of stir tank reaction for the most part. It's very common. And the example I give on how common is when we were talking to a growth stage startup in a different space, and I was chatting with their CTO. And he's like, well, actually, we use stir reactors too, and we've got some downtime. So if you can't scale your facility fast enough, you can use our downtime to do some pilots. And I was like, that's insane. I think there's still a lot of learning to be had there. At each stage of development, there's this adjustment. We're doing R&D on small reactors, and then we have to do R&D on larger reactors, right? There's going to be an adjustment to that system and process throughout. But we're really optimistic that because of this use of conventional equipment, there's no fermentation, which can be expensive. We'll be able to move that needle faster, or at least with lower CapEx in the initial days.
And just to go back to this point about, I'm going to just say distributed biological manufacturing, you're using linseed oil, you say is your feedstock. Are you able to use other kinds of feedstock? Is that something that you guys have prepared for? When I think about moving production of a plastic or a plastic replacement to another place, I always think, well, the feedstock isn't necessarily going to be the same. How do you adjust for that?
That's a great question, because one of the challenges our space has is that oil and gas has figured out how to take oil from here and oil from there and make it look the same, even though it's not. But I believe that ag companies have too, right? To give credit to the big ag and big chemical companies, they have put in some work that we're getting to take advantage of. 10 years ago, these supply chains were not scaled, did not exist at the price points they exist today. And that's why we can be competitive. But we look at, like, let's say textile manufacturing, the bulk of that's in Asia. Well, Canada and China are the two biggest producers of linseed oil. However, linseed oil is just an example of one of the feedstocks that we give. We can use waste materials. So like we're dying to try French fry oil, but we can also use recycled monomers. So we have not only other bio-based feedstocks like linseed that we can take advantage of, we can also use those recycled. And so we think of it as renewable formulations, and depending on the customer. So an example I give is our lead compound. We have a variation of our lead compound that's 80% bio-based, 90% bio-based, and 100% bio-based. It's the same functionality, but it's those input decisions that you make that determine the price and the bio-based content. What's exciting for us is that our early customers, they want 100%, right? They're like, give me the 100. Like, we're working with you and we're paying an early premium in the early days. We want it 100%. And so our hope is to be able to focus on those formulations and with those kinds of customers.
Your company's, is it fairly new? You mentioned that Phil started working on this during COVID. I mean, for his research was much, much larger.
Yes, they started this R&D at Envisioning with industry partners. It's been in R&D for about 7 years. And so something that is unique to us is that the business is new, but the tech is as de-risked as it can be at a seed stage. We have an advantage of this understanding of the feedstock relationships. And what we say makes our supply chain resilient is this plethora of feedstocks we can work with. We're not limited to a singular feedstock. So we do have that optionality. That is not to say it's going to be easy. I still think this is going to be really, really hard, but we've tried to de-risk everything we can de-risk at this stage.
It seems like you like hard challenges, being an entrepreneur and your background. So I'm sure a challenge accepted on your behalf. So then in that case, things are fairly new. You talked about a lead compound. Can you talk about what that lead compound is and what type of applications it could be a part of?
Our lead compound is a thermoplastic coating. So on our team is somebody named Ben Galfin. He led material sciences at Patagonia for 8 years. He led a team of engineers there, and their whole job was to find new materials and integrate it into their supply chain. These specs we've been, I guess you could say, marching towards are specs that Ben has sourced many times over and over and over again. And so that gives us a bit of a competitive advantage because we're not starting from scratch and understanding how our technology plugs in and what kind of equipment it'll work on. Our thesis, and we'll find out how accurate this is very soon, is if our specs directly match that polyurethane spec, that then means it should work on that manufacturing line in the same way. Maybe there'll be some adjustment of temperature, like you see with 100% petro versus some level of bio-based polyurethane. Usually it's an adjustment of temperature, but we've been working towards applications that he is incredibly familiar with, and he has built many products across those specs. It's also a spec that can be a coating for like a soft luggage or synthetic leather, real leather. So I think as you saw at BioFabricate, we're hoping to partner with a lot of these material companies that need that final component to reach that 100% bio-based or have the recyclability or end-of-life options that their customers are looking for.
I was just going to say that it's probably the same thing because when Carl and I went to BioFabricate 2 years ago, Carl's like, Iram, all these companies are looking for bio-based coatings. Let's start a bio-based coatings company. And I'm like, Carl, I was like, that's a huge undertaking. And then he told me that he met you and that there's people out there that can now, service all of these biomaterial companies. So it's amazing that you're here now. Carl, you predicted it.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what I was going to say, Jacqueline. That was really the reason why I was super excited to talk to you, because 2 years ago at BioFabricate, everyone was talking about coatings. All the materials people, so Polybion, Milo, all of the alternate leather, Tomtex, they were all talking about coatings. And for me, it was a revelation because all of a sudden I realized, wow, all this stuff gets coated in polyurethane. So everybody's creating these sustainable materials, but they're still, excuse my French, they're still fucking it up because they're putting up plastic on it. I ended up having conversations with Ecovative and Polybion about it. And they were like, well, we're looking for it. And so lo and behold, here you were at BioFabricate. Hopefully you've talked to all of them.
They're incredible companies. We feel very lucky for the opportunity to get to partner with some of those. Each of their materials is unique. And so like one of the things that I think we're all going to learn together, and this is my hypothesis, is that because those are novel materials and almost like novel textiles, that conventional specs probably won't be a fit. I guess you could say one of the fun challenges is like if you give me a conventional leather coating, that's a spec that's understood. But these other materials that I think are the future, we're going to get to learn alongside them what that means to service them. They've been really supportive. They've been really helpful in understanding what they're using versus what they would like to use, what price points they find acceptable. As you can imagine, the chemicals company is not very forthright. They're like, yeah, this is what we charge and here are our specs. Absolutely not. Like that is something that we've had to really dig deep to find data points around.
Yeah, it's super exciting. I think I've said it on the podcast before, but we've worked with K18, continue to work with K18 on the hair care side. And the K18 scientists shared a paper with me about formulating with biology and how it is just completely new. You can't formulate with biotech products the same way you formulate with chemistry. And we've had 150 years of formulating cosmetics and beauty and personal care products with chemistry. So now we basically have to start all over again with these new materials that offer different performance characteristics. And It's the same thing on the material space. Like all those new alternative leather materials, they will have different performance characteristics. And then when you throw your coating on it, the performance characteristics change, probably for the better. And then in the long term, you'll be able to create these materials that are much more sustainable. So I think it's super exciting.
Thank you. We're excited. It's been so eye-opening because, of course, there's coatings for those kinds of materials. Some synthetic leather is just polyurethane. I had a belt sold to me as vegan leather in 2015. I looked at it recently and I saw it said 100% polyurethane. I was like, oh, sneaky of them. Whatever evil genius came up with vegan leather was truly an evil genius because I'm like, what marketing? I think that's where we have to push back. We have to create that same level of excitement with consumers and understanding of those nuances. But there's anti-shedding coatings, electronics coatings. And I was like, wow, this is fascinating. Even if you just look at coatings, how many variations of that is possible, which again is why we believe that how we build our business has to be rooted in future systems like AI. I don't think there will be companies that are like, oh, this is an AI company. There's no such thing as being a big data company anymore. All companies are big data companies, or how the internet used to be uppercase and now it's lowercase. There used to be internet companies. Now everybody's an internet company. We're trying to make sure that we think through how do we build this business in a way to create outsized impact in the fastest route possible? That's what gets us excited.
We recently had Ross McBee of Tomtex on the pod, and he was talking about their materials, which are bio-based. He's going to hate me for saying leather alternative because it had its own unique characteristics. It's not leather, it could be different things. But I'm just curious to know two things. One is, for the coating, how does it affect the biodegradability of different materials? And is there a material that you guys have tested specifically? Like you mentioned textiles, but what type of textiles have you coated? And have you done any tests on that? And what was the result of it? Just curious to see that world and how you interact with biomaterials.
To answer the first question, I did biodegradation studies with Argonne National Lab back in 2021 with some of our initial formulations. Again, we're like 170 now. We'd have to do it for everyone, but they showed that we are ASTM and ISO compatible and can be composted. You've probably done whole podcasts on compostability.
And we've talked about it a lot, yeah.
Right? Like and with biodegradation, it's interesting because I think people think, oh, biodegradation will just start degrading. I was like, it's in various specific, like if you stick your car underwater, yeah, for a long time. But it's so dependent. That carries such depth and meaning. But we've also done recyclability studies. So we've recycled and reused actually this sample right here. It's coated onto leather. We dyed it black. We were just playing around. Again, we didn't get into the lab until recently. So my co-founder literally had to keep recycling and reusing. So this is leather that he coated this onto. But we've done nylon, cotton, and polyester, as well as been able to reclaim off of those textiles. What we say is that we've done all the early lab bench scale testing you can. So the big one in our space for, especially if you think about fashion, that durability. So we did the laundry test. So we washed and dried it 30 times with soap tied. That question comes up. So very specifically tied soap. My co-founder had to do it in his house. His wife almost killed him. So he was literally washing and drying samples in his house 30 times. What we showed is our formulations have that stability, have that durability, while still providing our customers with multiple end-of-life options. And again, with much lower toxicity, 1 million times safer. Is pretty wild. And so for us, those are touch points that are very exciting.
And just to be clear, what was that he was washing? What was a piece of clothing, if it was? And what was the coating on the clothing for?
It was actually dog bones. So we did just a core product to see how it would go. These are dyed, but the core product, washing and drying it to see how it goes. The early format we expect to ship in is in thermoplastic chips with an aim of getting to water-based dispersions quickly thereafter.
So when you say thermoplastic chips, what you're talking about is your material, that will be the form factor that it ships in. And does that mean that makes it easier to put into an existing supply chain? Am I understanding right?
Yes. So as you imagine, textile manufacturing has a wide range of equipment. Ben on our team, who's again our head of product applications, has worked with many manufacturers who thermally process chips as a coating. For us as a small team, that is the easiest way to get product out the door without having to invest in a more sophisticated system so that we can get the proof point. So like me as CEO, my thought is always, how can I prove revenue as quickly as possible in the most simplistic way possible so that I can live long enough to fight another day and then tackle these other systems? So our focus is either folks who can thermally process these in the early days, which again, Ben is very familiar with those manufacturers, and while working with partners to get in place more sophisticated delivery systems like water-based dispersions, we are staying away from more solvent systems because we do see a very near future in which those might be regulated out. And we want to align with what we think is the sort of the future of sustainability in this space.
Can you paint a picture for us or for our listeners in terms of what does a thermal dispersion process look like? What goes in and what comes out?
So this is like a really funny version, but please remember that we didn't get into a real lab until recently. So Phil literally takes chips and put this in a panini press.
Yeah, so just so that our listeners know, Jackie is holding up a piece of leather that is undyed, except for in the middle has like kind of a black splotch. And so what you're saying is he took that piece of leather, put it in a panini press, and then added the chips on top of it, pressed it with the panini press so that the coating would coat the leather.
Yes, and that black splotch is our coating. So we dye our coating, and for those who can't see, the black splotch on the leather. So this rest is uncoated and this is coated.
Got it. So what does it look like at a big textile manufacturer? You've got this material being applied to under heat, and then when it comes out, then it gets turned into whatever the apparel garment is.
Yes. So we will ship drums of essentially plastic pellets, just like incumbents would. So imagine big barrels of just plastic chips. We will ship those to folks who then can melt it on as a coating onto different fabrics or different materials. Again, there's lots of different ways to do coatings and textiles. We felt like this was a delivery system we could do right away with lower costs to understand our potential while continuously evaluating water-based systems. And we actually just made an exciting hire with somebody who's an expert in water-based polyurethane systems. So we're very excited for them to get started because we know that that's what a lot of our other early customers would like to trial.
I just want to say thank you, Jackie, for indulging me and answering that question so succinctly. Because one of the things that Iram and I talk about is part of the reason we have this podcast is because we are infinitely curious and our curiosity is always expanded by the people who come on. And today you have educated me about things that I had no idea about. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Manufacturing is one of those things that when you see it, just clicks. What I wish I could do is just bring investors with me on every manufacturing tour and be like, this, because I'll never forget. I was in Italy visiting an early manufacturer, and I was there with this amazing Frenchman who was trying to understand our technology for his customers. There's a bit of a language barrier. And I'm like, you know what? I'm visiting a manufacturer tomorrow. Just come with me. And at the end of the tour, he's like, I get it. It's not leather. It's plastic. I'm like, yes. He's like, but it looks like leather. I was like, yes. I was like, exactly that. I was like, so instead of that toxic plastic, they're going to use our nice, earth-friendly plastic. It's so hard to explain something that is such a physical process.
We recently had Julia Marsh from Sway on the pod, and she was also explaining some of the manufacturing behind her thin film plastic, what they're making at Sway. And I said it to her, I'll say it to you, is that we need like a Mr. Rogers type of video where it's behind the scenes. This is how the sausage is made. Because those are hypnotizing. I have a 3-year-old, so I always watch like those videos. And we do watch old school Mr. Rogers too. But it gets very hypnotizing to see how these manufacturing plants work and how the factory lines work. You can just watch them all day.
Yeah, I think there's a series how it works, and it shows you how everything is made. And it is fascinating.
It's so fun.
Yeah.
I love physical products. I joke, I wish I had a good B2B SaaS idea, but I definitely live in physical products and supply chains. And it's also the global nature of the industry, I think is so fun because you know the impact. For us, it's exciting. These folks know that the chemicals they're interacting with are brutal. Many of them, I'd like to think, would like to create a safer work environment for folks. It's interesting. There's a $90 billion lawsuit against the chemical companies for hiding how dangerous isocyanates are, not just to workers, but consumers. So I think we're still on this learning curve of how these materials not only impact our environmental well-being, but personal well-being. But again, the variations of applications are numerous. And that's where that magic layer of software, I think, comes in.
Yeah. And you mentioned you just hired someone new who's a specialist. Before we actually recorded, you had some news to share that you're progressing. We'd love to hear a little bit more about your progress and what's in store for Matereal.
Absolutely. I think the big one, I actually got too excited, I shared it early, was that we now have toxicity data. We knew that our product was safer. It's hard when you're just storytelling that. It's hard to even put numbers to the fact that isocyanates are the leading cause of work-related asthma. I have asthma. If anyone's ever had an asthma attack, it's terrifying to think that we're causing this. You hear about cancer alleys. You hear about these communities that are just being devastated by these plastic companies, these chemical companies. For us to be able to now have data, numbers that show, no, we're not just saying we're safer. We are that much safer is really exciting for our team because we've been waiting months. And as you can imagine, it's really like one of the first tools to measure this. I used to tell my founders, there's no one way to measure carbon emissions. And that's a challenge in this space. There's not uniformity in measuring tools. Not even investors agree on how to think about carbon impact because our emissions reduction potential shows gigatons of impact. But for us to show the true impact of our technology, I would literally have to do an emissions reduction potential model on every variation of polyurethane. And I was like, I don't have the money to do that much ERP modeling. So to even just have this high level data that points to, you could say like equivalent impact in worker safety is really exciting for us because we do think that this challenge is dual and we don't think we can look at it from just one angle. Otherwise, we'll leave a lot of people behind. And I think that's where the environmental justice lens has to be applied. I think we all spoke to the fact that I'm Latina. So a lot of people, when they talk about frontline communities, they're talking about people they don't know. Well, these are people I know. This is my family. These are my friends who work in those factories and who do that manufacturing abroad. It's very near and dear to my heart because it's not some ambiguous community I don't know. It's people I've worked with close to over a decade. I think it's easy to talk about environmental justice from a faraway lens or talk about bringing renewable energy to these folks. But there's a reason a lot of this manufacturing was moved out of the US. It was deemed unsafe. So like our plastic pollution problem, where we just keep dumping it on other countries, we're like, all right, you guys deal with these cancerous materials, not us. And that's not okay. We are building a company that we believe is scalable and can have outsized returns for our investors, yes, but we want it to have outsized returns for the communities that we care about as well.
That's amazing. You worked in venture and you worked as an advisor to startups for several years. And when it comes to sustainability and supply chain, is there any advice you have for entrepreneurs that are in that space or looking to get into that space?
Go see it for yourself. The advice I give in terms of manufacturing supply chain, it's a relationship business. The pandemic is over. I think that the opportunity is to go and see these things for yourselves. I'm a very visual learner, so maybe I'm just stubborn and that's the only way I learn is to show up and go touch things. But that's, I think, the fastest way anybody to understand what are the challenges in this space and why it is so critical that we make the investments required in this space to do this transition in a just way. But I think that would be my overwhelming advice is go see it. And if you want to get into sustainability, volunteer. I was a volunteer for sustainable companies for years, and it helped me craft my thesis on where I would be most helpful. I didn't know where would I have the greatest impact. And I'd been offered roles at different climate companies before, but I knew that I wasn't the right fit because I knew who I was and what I was capable of. So that's why when I met Matereal, I was like, oh no, this is where my skill set is perfectly complementary to my co-founder and his genius. So I always joke I'm the money to his genius. But it's a great role. It's super fun for me. But yeah, go see it, go touch it and understand. And honestly, go watch somebody manufacture with solvents and tell me how dizzy you get afterwards. I remember I was with Ben visiting some manufacturers and I was literally getting dizzy. And he's like, whatever you do, don't go see the factories that make wetsuits. He's like, you'll die. If 10 minutes in a facility like that can make somebody lightheaded, I think really understanding what it feels like to walk through those spaces. And these people are trying. They're trying to make it clean. They're trying to do right by their workers. And it's still a challenge.
Yeah, that's a very, very powerful piece of advice to go see it. I think, especially in our world, you mentioned COVID, but also just being in front of screens all day. We'll see things through a screen, which makes things harder to comprehend that they're real. I'm looking at you through a screen. I know you are real. And when I see you in person, there is still a difference because there's a lot of people that meet each other via virtual call and they see each other in person and it's a completely different experience. I think that is a very powerful thing. Don't just hide behind your computers. Go out there in the real world and see what's going on. And then you'll have a completely different perspective and you can be more motivated into doing something. That's very, very powerful. Thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. You'd be surprised who will let you visit.
Yeah.
The worst thing they can say is no, but chances are they'll let you visit.
We covered all our questions. Was there anything else, Jackie, that we should have asked you or that you wanted to cover?
Maybe just thank you to you all for having me. Thank you to Suzanne and Amy from Biofabricate who made this connection possible. I have found that some of the most important moments in my career come from community leaders who bring people together. So just want to give them a quick shout out. Clearly, they're such a huge part of this community. But no, thank you for having me.
Yeah, let us know when you're in New York. We would love to host you, have some people meet you, and just hang out and say, hey, in person.
I come a lot. I used to live in the Seaport, so I'm there at least once a quarter.
Nice.
Definitely let us know. Yeah, Suzanne lives right on the corner, so we'll all get together for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Hey.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Iram, what do you think of that interview?
Wow, Jackie is pure leadership. I mean, I loved speaking with her. She talked about so many different aspects of running a company, how it influences the environment, how it influences the people that are working in traditional chemical companies that are making coatings today. And I'd say that she is another shining example of someone from a different industry. So in her case, VC, climate tech, and seeing biology as a solution. She found the right partners, the experts, and started a company. I mean, what a wonderful story.
Yeah, she's awesome. One of the things that stood out, you're the one who put the note down, was that their process is 1,000,000 times less toxic than the existing polyurethane processes. That is amazing. I mean, you see it in the news, you see studies on it, but I still think we really don't know what the toxic effects of plastics are. on human biology, not to mention what they're doing to the environment. So learning that something is a million times less toxic is incredible.
Yeah, I want to see the math on that and like what are all the factors. She's incredibly smart. Her team with scientists from all over that have expertise. I would love to learn more about that. The next time we have her on, we could dig into it some more. And I'm sure she'll have even stronger metrics. Like being a million times less toxic is huge. So we'd love to learn a little bit more about that. It's starting to become more discussed when we're talking about plastics and how they affect petroleum products, which plastics are a petroleum product, and how they are permeating in our water and in our environment and the effects that it has on our body. I mean, we're starting to talk about it. Maybe, like you're saying, the specific biological interactions aren't commonly spoke about, but let's talk about it. Let's figure that out. I'm sure there's already studies out there, but that those stories aren't brought up. I don't think anybody wants to just create toxic effects on people on the planet, but people are fighting back. Jackie mentioned in this interview that there's $90 billion of lawsuits against chemical companies for the adverse effects that they have on people and planet. And it'd be great to learn what are the claims against these chemical companies specifically. But it's good to hear that there is justice being served.
All right. Well, as we close things out, we've got a couple of interesting things coming up. A bunch of us, I think, are going up to ferment at Ginkgo Bioworks in Boston in mid-April. If you're going, you should let us know. Iram, you won't be going this year, unfortunately, because you're traveling to Brazil for a wedding, and you're going to a place that is a favorite place of mine in my imagination, which is Florianopolis. I've never been there, but I've written extensively about that part of Brazil. So congratulations to your friend who's getting married, and congratulations to you for going there.
Thank you.
I want to hear the notes. Then shortly thereafter, beginning of May, is Symbio Beta. And what we've talked about is that for our next episode, we're going to do a masterclass on how to prepare for going to a conference. So a little different from our single episodes where we just talk, one of us is talking about something we've done. We're actually going to do something for our community and help you get ready for your next conference attendance. So if you're attending any of these conferences or you're going to an event, you'll want to listen in. Anything else, Iram?
Yeah, if you're going to the conference, if you're going to Symbio Beta, we have a discount code. Just use the code GROWEVERYTHING upon registration of Symbio Beta, and you get $300 off, which is a huge chunk of money. And besides that, please leave us a review. We would love to hear from you. Share what you learned so people that are considering listening can have an idea of what was interesting to you, what questions that you have. It's obviously interesting to us, and we'll read it or share it. And please stay in touch. We love to hear from you. This is a community. We're growing, and we're very excited to be doing this with you.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's the pod. We'll talk to you next time.